Okay, getting started on session 5, Intro to Church Planting, and we're ready to talk about preparation. We've kind of talked about being called to plant churches. We've talked about our family and how a decision like that might affect them and how we need to include them in the decision making. We talked about the principles of team ministry. How would that look if we were to put that together? What kind of things are important? And are we going to let that be to feel like we have to do it as a team? Or are we going to say, well, but maybe God might want a guy to go out alone just with his family and build the team out of the people that he wins, And I think the conclusion we came to is not really a right and wrong, just whatever God's leading and whatever will work best in your particular life and your particular needs. So before we go, though, we've got to make some preparations. If God's going to use us to plant this church, we can't just fly into town, throw up a tent and say, here we go. I mean, there's some things that have to take place for preparation. And if we can get these things done in advance, it's really going to save us a lot of trouble down the road. And I'll have to admit that this is a part for me that's really difficult because I'm such a doer that I have that sensation, I have that feeling. Just let me get there and get going, And the problem is, though, that you start encountering challenges and roadblocks because you didn't do some things on the front end. And even my personality sometimes will tend to say, well, that's all right, I'll deal with it when I get to it, but you can really save yourself a lot of time and be a lot more effective if you make the proper preparations on the front end. Most people that have enough ambition to be involved in church planting are people of action, just like I was talking about. And they can make that mistake if they're not careful of just wanting to, be the Apostle Peter and just get out there and do something, even if it's wrong, But we need to make the proper plans and the proper preparation. The very first thing, of course, is a sponsoring church. Or sending is becoming a much more popular terminology nowadays, which is good terminology. Sending is actually probably better terminology than sponsoring, just in a biblical sense, because when we talk about missions, that's what we're talking about, to send. That's what the Latin word mitto means, and the Greek word apostolion, which is where we get our idea of missions, to be sent forth. So sending church is probably a more scriptural term, although depending on who you're talking to, a lot of people, some people wouldn't really get that idea because they're used to sponsoring church. Even years ago, some people used to say mother church, which is really kind of weird because it sounds almost Catholic, but that's kind of is a term that used to be used years ago as mother church. Now, this is not an unimportant decision. In fact, this is probably one of the most critical decisions you'll make if God's going to use you to plant a church. Of course, again, our emphasis for this class is stateside church planting, but really anywhere in the world you would go as a missionary. This is one of the critical decisions that you're going to make, and you need to make sure that you spend plenty of time in prayer, that you spend plenty of time seeking God's will, because your sponsoring church can definitely make or break you. And there are sponsoring churches that I don't know if you guys are familiar with this term or not, but are just a rubber stamp. I And what that means is, like,
Authority.
yeah, just boom, okay, you're good to go, you're certified, but that's it. They're just, it's almost like, because we believe the Bible teaches you have to have a sponsoring church, we'll do this for you. But there's not a whole lot more to it than that. And then there are churches that are what I call under my thumb sponsoring churches, which is the kind of sponsoring church that you can't really breathe. They got their hand in everything you're doing. You have very little freedom or liberty. You basically have to contact them for every decision you're making. Even some sponsoring churches go as far to say, that you can't baptize anyone without, contacting us first, and, the church will vote, about baptizing them. You can't take the Lord's Supper. If you're going to take the Lord's Supper, you have to come here and take it. Which actually, I don't know that I want to spend time today talking about all that, but to me, those ideas totally, they would say that they're defending the ideas of the local church and the authority of the local church. But to me, they're actually contradicting the teaching of the local church. Because what they're saying, and this, you'll hear this still today, this very common belief that those people down there in that mission work, that new church plant, they are members of our church. Because this is our missionary that we sent out. All those people are members of our church. So, we've got to ask, we've got to be a part of this decision-making process, and if they take communion, they got to take it with us because they're members of our church. Man, oh man, I just don't know how you can support that from the scriptures whatsoever. And when you look at what Paul did, obviously those groups had autonomy from the time that they were brought together and congregated, and Paul would move on and go to the next thing, and you come back and check on them, but he didn't, and then they would raise up leaders. Obviously they had autonomy. So to me, that kind of situation where you're under our thumb and we're going to tell you what to do, that's a really dangerous situation. And then I think that the other, maybe the way I would express another one is, maybe just to say a supportive church, a church that is there for counsel. And I think the way that that works, and we'll talk a little bit more in detail about it as we go on, but where you sit down on the front end and you agree, here's my vision, here's what I think God's called me to do. They agree that they want to be a part of that. You sit down and you talk about all the details in advance. Here's the way we're going to go about it. Here's the, our doctrinal position. You lay all the cards out on the table to begin with. That doesn't mean that as you go along, you might not have to change or adjust a little bit. But if you do as much as you can to get it all out in the front end and everybody agrees, then no big deal. Go do what we agreed we were all going to do. And we'll be here for you to help you in any way that we can. But you've got freedom and you've got liberty. I definitely would not serve under a church that wasn't willing to do that. That wasn't willing just to sit down with me on the front end. Let's all agree about what we're going to do. All right. You've got freedom and liberty to do that. We want to be involved in it, but we're not going to micromanage and control your every move. And so...
Is it dangerous for some of these missionaries you see that are just saying we're looking for a sponsoring church, and that they would probably just be willing to take the first one that jumped on board to send them somewhere? You think that's kind of dangerous for them to do?
I think there is some danger there, yeah. And I don't know if when they do that, like they'll be in a public, like at an association meeting or something, and they'll share, I feel God's called us to go do this, and one of the things we need you to pray for is we need a sponsoring church. I I don't know if they're doing that because they just think that's the best way to get a sponsoring church, is just to announce it publicly, or if they are desperate, and that they're basically having to advertise,
Could be laziness too, you think?
I guess that's possible. But to me, when God calls you to go do something
He's not.
in mission, the world of missions, there ought to be 2 or 3 churches that just come to mind that I've got a connection with that, man, that might, be a good sponsoring church. Or where God will just raise up, it's not, you weren't necessarily looking, but God just raised up the situation, and, after praying about it, well, that really seems pretty clear that that's God's will. I didn't necessarily have a lot of former experience with this church, but, that seems pretty apparent that that's God's will. So I always, if I was seeking a sponsoring church, that's the kind of channels I would go through, and I wouldn't ever announce it publicly. My first public announcement would be, this is our sponsoring church.
So you wouldn't start deputation until you had a sponsoring church?
Yeah, definitely wouldn't. And I would just, now that doesn't mean that I would sit around and do nothing. I would call pastors and share my burden with them and say, hey, we're praying, for God to raise up a sponsoring church, and I'm contacting you because I know you, and as I prayed about it, I wondered, if your church might possibly be interested. And it's fine to contact people and ask them, but I wouldn't go public with it until I had it.
Do you go along with the most money?
Not necessarily. I think that there probably is a bottom side to that, where you might say, well, this church has a good heart, and I'm sure that they would do all that they could, but they're really not financially in a position to do this. And, that would be a factor for me, but, not necessarily like just compare 5 or 6 and say, well, that one's got the most money, so I think I'll go that direction. Well, let's talk a little bit more about this from the standpoint of the scriptures. Again, return to Acts 13. I know we look at it a lot, but it really is the key passage for what we're talking about here. The church at Antioch and their sponsorship of Barnabas and Saul. Now there were in the church that was at Antioch certain prophets and teachers, as Barnabas and Simeon, that was called Niger, and Lucius of Cyrene, and Manaen, which had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul. As they ministered to the Lord and fasted, the Holy Ghost said, separate me, Barnabas and Saul, for the work whereunto I have called them. And when they had fasted and prayed, they laid their hands on them and sent them away. Now, the thing that stands out there to me, there's lots of things that stand out, but for our purpose today, is it seems to me that the Spirit called Barnabas and Saul, but the Spirit also called the church at Antioch to be the senders. And of course, in this particular case, Barnabas and Saul were members of that church, and they were serving in that church, which a lot of times is the way that something like that could happen. If a person was a member of a church that they were serving in, I would not recommend asking a church that you were pastoring to be your sponsoring church. I wouldn't recommend that. If you were there as a staff member, that's probably a little bit different, because in that, I don't know the right term to use, but not being the lead role, you usually don't have as much forceful leadership, as you do as being the pastor. And, the thing about the church that you pastored being your sending church, it can be problematic on both ends. It can be problematic for you You know, what if the next pastor that comes along has a jealous chip on his shoulder, you know? He gets sick and tired of hearing these people say, well, Brother so-and-so always did this, and Brother so-and-so always did that. He decided the best way to take care of that is for you not to be their missionary anymore, and he'll, you know, figure out a way, you know, to take care of it. Or it can also create a situation where, rightfully so, people would still feel connected to you because you're their missionary, even though you're not their pastor anymore. And so it's an easier bridge for them to call you and try to bend your ear about, you know, church problems or what's going on with the new pastor. And I don't know, there's just enough little caveats there that I wouldn't say that it would never work. In fact, I've seen it done where it did work. But I'd be really, really careful about pursuing that kind of situation. But that you're serving there as a staff member, that's a little bit more workable for me. Or even, you know, you're just a member of this church when God calls you, you know, to do this work. So that's what happened with Barnabas and Saul. And then you look later on in chapter 14, verses 26 and 27, and thence they sailed to Antioch, from whence they had been recommended to the grace of God for the work which they fulfilled. And when they were come and had gathered the church together, they rehearsed all that God had done with them, and how he had opened a door of faith unto the Gentiles. So here we see, you know, not only did Antioch send them, but they reported to Antioch. That would speak of accountability being involved, but also just the joy of knowing what had happened and being a part of, yeah, you know, we sent you and we rejoice in what you're telling us that God has done. So they make report to their sending church. And the point is that God has always operated through this kind of authority, through the local church, to do his kingdom business here on the earth, and we're not looking to change that. We're not looking to go any other direction. Now, there are various options and opinions, as we've already said, about the role of the sponsoring church. I was blessed my whole time to have sponsoring church that gave me a lot of freedom. But you know, even there, you've got to be kind of cautious, because giving the missionary freedom can also maybe come to the point of apathy on the part of the sponsoring church. Oh, Brother Scott's, he's got it under control. You know, he's been our missionary for several years. You know, no problem. Where sometimes the missionary might need his sponsoring pastor or the church to say, well, hey, hang on a second, let's think about this a little bit, you know. Because enough freedom with no accountability, really, just because, not in a bad way, but they just trust you. I mean, they just completely trust you. You know, you don't always have the right answer. You don't always have everything figured out. And you can hang yourself, you know, with your freedom. And so you just need a good, healthy balance there of that, to where you don't actually run into problems as a result of it. The missionary does not need a sponsoring church that is going to choke him out, not let him breathe, not let him do what God has called him to do. And so, as we've already said, sit down, work it all out in the beginning. Again, that doesn't mean that there might not be some changes along the way. But if those changes come along, sit back down and talk about it. You know, don't just say, oh, well, I'll do whatever I want to. No, you know, this is different from what we talked about. So let me go and talk through this with them and make sure this is going to be okay, get it all hammered out. Now, I think that a really good idea is to have a missions agreement. To have a situation where we write this stuff down on paper and we sign it and we agree to it. I don't think that represents a lack of trust. I don't think that represents a premise of trying to start off on the basis we don't have any confidence in one another. I think it's just trying to, you can sit down and discuss something and then you can forget what you said. And if you have it on paper, it really helps. For example, when I came back from Kenya, due to the health concerns, it was in our agreement what would happen. We had thought about that possibility in advance, not thinking it would happen, but in case it did happen. And there was, specific details within our agreement about if this happens, here's what will happen. Here's how everything will work out, and even details about, pay, or, do you just stop paying the guy right away, or do you pay him another month or so, or, how does that work out? All that was within our agreement. One of the most detailed agreements I ever had was with Grace Baptist when they sent me here to Indiana to do church planting. And I appreciated it. It was really good. It was a 2-page document. It talked about the authority that they were giving me, and they spelled out clearly. They were giving me authority to go start this church, to baptize converts, to conduct the Lord's Supper, and just on and on, all the authority they were giving me. It did talk about pay. It talked about the financial expectations on the new church, that they would give a certain percentage to missions, that they would give a certain percentage towards the missionary salary, and all those kind of things, that they would pay all the on-field expenses. That was all listed in there. How many revivals could I go do per year? All that stuff, so that we didn't end up later on with a problem, and we had it clearly spelled out how these things would be handled. Hopefully it's the kind of thing that you really just don't have to use. We agreed about it, we talked about it, we got it on paper, we all signed it, but things just go smooth, and we don't ever even have to really look at this thing. But sometimes things happen, and you need a point of reference to be able to go back and say, well, look, this is what we said we would do. So we're all clear. Here it is right here on paper. This is what we said we would do. So we don't have any problems working it out. We just do what we said we would do. If you and the potential sponsoring church disagree on a key issue, or if you feel that you have to be less than completely open with them, go find another sponsoring church. It's just that clear. You don't want to start out on that kind of grounds. You want to be clear about things. And if I feel like I'm sitting down here and I'm kind of walking on eggshells, I'm saying what we're going to do, but I'm not saying everything because I'm afraid they might not like it, that's just not a good situation.
Do your churches dictate like your worship format or anything? Like what type of music you'd sing, or do they usually get freedom? Is there churches that are that strict and stringent on what they're
Yeah, there definitely is. In fact, when we planted the work at Nineveh, our worship was very different from our sponsoring church's worship. But they knew that. It wasn't something that had been concealed. Like when they came up to visit, it's like, okay, put the drums and the guitars away, and we'll just do all hymns today. You don't need that kind of situation. If you feel that God's leading you to do something in a certain way, then you ought to be able to communicate that with your sponsoring church. And if they say, no, we're not going to allow that, okay, well, this is probably not the Lord's will then, because He'd give us harmony on that if that was the case. So we'll just back up and pray about who does God want, to send us. And we'll wait and let God show His will. So, it's just amazing how God can do that. It really, absolutely is amazing how He can raise those things up and make those things happen. And I guess that would be kind of the closing thought is be willing to be patient and let God do it. If you do it, it might end up being a mess. You know, just let God do it, and He'll show you the way. The next thing that I want to talk to you about is personal finance. Because your financial situation will impact your work. Manna is not just going to fall from heaven like it did in the wilderness. Well, actually, I take that back. It probably will, but you know, when the manna fell, they didn't just pick it up and eat it like cotton candy. It was the material they needed to, you know, they took that stuff and baked it and, you know, made food out of it. So God's going to provide, but you have to, you know, God helps those that helps themselves kind of thinking. I mean, you have to be willing to do that. And what God's not going to do is He's not going to erase the consequences of your bad decisions just because you decided to go plant a church. And if you've made poor decisions financially, then, you know, I've made poor decisions financially. And the consequences followed me, and it took me a little while to get past that, you know. And what you might want to do is you might want to make that a top priority. If I feel like God's going to send me, I would say this even for anybody that's entering the ministry. But, you know, for our specific application, I feel like God's going to send me to plant a church. I want to make sure that my finances are in order, and that I'm not going to struggle. I mean, we know that God will meet our needs. We know that He's promised to meet our needs. But He's never promised to meet our wants. He's never promised to meet our extravagancy. And so we've got to get this area in our life under control. Now, as far as, you know, just how am I going to get paid? You know, for example, you know, you could get a salary through the ABA. They have a, you know, program where that's a possibility. If you're a sponsoring church wanting to recommend you, you could get that salary. What they actually do, there's a salary number and they pay 80% of it. And then you and your sponsoring church are responsible to raise the other 20%. Some people do tricky things like just ask their missionary to live on the 80% instead of raising the 20%. But that's, you know, that's a possibility. Another possibility is you could have a secular job. Could, you know, just say, well, I'm going to go plant this church, but I'm also going to work, you know. I had the blessing of not having to work, you know, the vast majority of the time that I was planting churches. And it was a blessing. You know, now, if you're going to use your extra time to sit around on the couch, then, you know, that's probably a waste. But if you're going to use your extra time to give 50, 60 hours a week to ministry, then that's a great reason to not work. And I would love it for God to provide that for all of His, you know, people. Now, why does it happen in some situations, not in others? I don't know. You know, just I guess we have to trust the Lord for His direction and His provision and what He's got going on at the time. Believe that there's a reason. And then the other way is designated funds or designated offerings, where you've got several churches that are contributing to your ministry. And these funds are usually raised through deputation, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But in my opinion, that's the best way to do it. You know, this is kind of nice because you don't have to do all that deputation travel. But I think that's a kind of a selfish motive, actually, because I think a lot of good things happen on deputation. I think that you make contacts and relationships that are going to be very important to what happens in the future of the work. And I also think that deputation is kind of a proving ground. You know, God called me to do this, I go out, but I can't raise the money. Well, what's wrong with this picture? And so I think it provides a good proving ground. There might be a combination of these two, you know, where you're working a part-time job and also receiving some offerings from the churches. But if you can find yourself fully supported by the designated offerings of various churches, I really think that that's the very best situation to be in. It's an extreme blessing to know that you got people behind you, and you know, it also exemplifies faith. Just depending that God's going to provide. Now, always remember that. Always remember that. It is God and not the churches that you're trusting. God is your supplier. God is your provider. He's your Jehovah Jireh. You trust Him. He does use the churches to do it, yes, but He's your provider. Now, being that we're talking about church planting here in the United States, that work option is always going to be available. You know, it's a possibility. Going to a foreign field, the vast majority of places, it's not a possibility. You know, they might give you a visa to come do mission work in their country, but they're not just going to give you a visa to come live there and, you know, work at the gas station. You know, they just, you know, you've got to prove your viability of why you're a benefit for them to grant you that visa. Now, under this situation right here, where you get to a salary through the ABA, you're not allowed to work. That's one of the criteria if you are receiving that salary. And it's like $3,400 a month. So, I don't see why most people would need to work, you know, if you hadn't messed yourself up financially. You know, $3,400 a month, that's pretty decent. And then on top of that, your sponsoring church can give you housing or auto allowance, pay your health insurance, so they can do additional things for you if they want to. But again, that's one of the mandates of that system is, you know, you're just not allowed to work.
On designated funds and salary, does that like your salary, or does that go to like the building fund? Or do you take out of it what you need to live on and the rest goes to the church? Or?
On designated
You're talking about
funds?
designated salary?
Yeah.
He's talking about salary.
Like if you're receiving it through the ABA, or if it's just from the churches?
Either way, it doesn't.
Okay, if you receive it through the ABA, it's supposed to be just your salary.
Oh, so that's not.
And so you can,
You
of
tithe and
course,
give offerings on
you
it.
can do whatever you want to with it as far as that goes, because it becomes yours. But I mean, that's the intention. The intention is not, we'll give this guy $3,500 a month so that he can live plus have enough money to rent a building. You know, that's not the intention. The intention is just to pay your salary. Now, designated funds, generally, all that's going to come out of the same, you know, pot. You know, so if you're like trying to build a building, but you just have to realize, okay, which is usually what you say to the churches that you go, you know, talk to. Well, we need this much money for personal support, and then in the future we'll be building a building, so, you know, we'll probably try to start a building fund. What we always did in our missions account is we had like at the end of the month, if we, you know, paid everything, and if the leftover balance was above a certain amount, which I think we used $5,000, then we took the excess and rolled it over to the building fund. You know, and that was, we encouraged the people of the mission to give to the building fund. And if sometimes other churches sent designated offerings, it was for that. But we had that rollover effect where rather than building up a big balance, we would do that. So, yeah, you've got some liberty and freedom. Now, in church planting, to me, and again, there's not a right or wrong, but you do want to teach the people, the new people that you're planting this church with, responsibility. And so to me, what we always did is we made the local congregation take responsibility for the on-field expenses. So whatever building we rented, whatever literature we bought, whatever outreach efforts we were going to try to do, if we needed tracts or if we needed to get something printed up or whatever, that was all the responsibility of that local group. And you might say, man, well, that's kind of limiting. Well, I guess, but maybe we need to be limited,
How do you get started out in there? Before, when you go into an area and you're getting people together, how can you just immediately start out? Okay, we're going to rent this area, you guys are going to fit the bill. You just work Bible studies and stuff as you build it up kind of thing before you get a building?
Of course, you could start in your home. You could start, a lot of times libraries have rooms you can use free of charge. Or a very modest, if you're just renting a room, a lot of times that's not very expensive. Maybe $25-30 for an hour or two. You can rent this room. So the cost is not astronomical. If you're making $3,500 a month, that's $350 in your tithe, even if you don't have anybody else giving yet. And so, again, it would limit what you could do, but it wouldn't, make it impossible.
So if you were on the salary thing, you're sponsoring churches, raised your other 20%, you had raised and they'd give you the other 20%, whatever, would you still go out on deputation to get funding for the mission?
You might do it for your building. You're not to me, not necessarily just like your rented building, but when you're buying land and building a building, we ask the churches for help that way. Now, what I found though is once I had my personal support raised, unless I had a conversation with a pastor that said, man, Bro Scott, I really want our church to do something for you, and can you come and share this with us? I found it just as effective to go to association meetings and things like that. But now, I really beat the bushes on that. I didn't just go to the Indiana State Association and the EPA and the national meeting. The vast majority of our support came from Arkansas. And so I would go down in the fall of the year, all of their local associations meet. And I'd go down there in September, October, in November. I'd make 6 or 7 trips down there. And I'd leave Indiana on a Friday morning and go to somewhere in Arkansas and a local association meet Friday night. And most of them would meet Friday night and Saturday, just like our state association does. So I'd go somewhere Friday night, but then there was another one meeting somewhere, and I'd go there on Saturday. So I'd go to 2 local associations, and I'd come back home Saturday afternoon and be at home to preach on Sunday. And sometimes there would be one on Thursday, so I could get in 3. Or sometimes I'd go, if they were close enough together, I'd go to 1 on Saturday morning, and when they break for the noon meal, I'd say my goodbyes and get somewhere else for Saturday afternoon to go to 1. So you can go to a lot of association meetings if you take the time to figure out where they're at and when they're meeting. And it doesn't, it's hard work, but if you are willing to put in the hours driving, it doesn't even have to take away from the work you're doing on the field very much. So lots of things that can be done. But again, just this basic level of support, no matter how it comes in, we know that God will provide for our needs. But something that we really need to be sure that we get a hold of is the concept of contentment. we need to be content. We need to, especially us here in America, the way we've been, the blessings that we've had. It's not even a negative thing necessarily, but we kind of have let ourselves get spoiled. And we think we need a lot of things that we don't, I mean, we're all walking around with these laptop computers. We've all got these phones, and a lot of us phones that do a lot of stuff, not just a regular phone, but a phone that'll do a lot of stuff. And on and on and on and on. Cable TV and, and none of that's wrong. None of that's wrong. But also, it's not really needed either. If we wanted to, we could trim way down. And so people that are going into the ministry, especially people that may see themselves end up doing mission work, I encourage them to really ask God to help them with the concept of contentment. To just be content. It's okay if I don't have these things. If I'm blessed financially, I can't have them, that's great. But it's okay if I don't have these things. All I really need is a roof over my head and food in my mouth. And, that's what I really need. And God's always provided way more than that for me. But still yet, in fact, even the roof over your head is debatable, because He said having food and raiment, be therewith content. And I know people that don't have a roof over their head. They don't know where they're going to sleep tonight. And they're not, homeless bums that maybe sometimes we think about here in the United States. But the Bible says in Philippians 4:11, not that I speak in respect of want, Paul says, for I have learned in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content. 1 Timothy 6, but godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into this world, it's certain we can carry nothing out, and having food and raiment, let us be therewith content. Hebrews 13:5, let your conversation be without covetousness, and be content with such things as ye have, for He has said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. And so just that idea, there's a lot of people that maybe they're content because they got everything, but if they were put in a situation where they couldn't have everything, and I know some of these examples may seem silly, but some people think that if they don't go to Starbucks every morning, that they're being cheated, I'll be able to go to Starbucks every morning, okay? Or I'll be able to go out to eat just anytime I want. That should never even be a question. If I want to go to McDonald's, if I want to go to Applebee's, if I want to go to whatever, I just ought to be able to go. Shouldn't even have to think about it. And that's the way a lot of people, again, predominantly through the blessing of God, have lived their life. But what if it's not that way anymore? And what if God's asking me to step down from a really good paying job to do this work for Him? Am I ready to be content with what I can afford rather than feeling like I've got to have all these things?
Yes, you can be content.
Certainly can.
You, Mr.
With the Lord's help.
Well, my wife didn't describe it, but that wasn't the case a year ago.
I do want to say that I believe that the man of God should be taken care of. I think that, take your Bibles and turn to 1 Corinthians.
You need to get with the times.
Chapter 9.
You and your paper Bible.
Well,
Are you watching this? Can I hear some? They had Bibles. Paper.
In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 9 says, for it is written in the law of Moses, thou shalt not muzzle the ox that treadeth the corn. Doth God take care for oxen? Then verse 13 says, do ye not know that they which minister about holy things live by the things of the temple? And they which wait at the altar are partakers with the altar. Even so hath the Lord ordained that they which preach the gospel should live of the gospel. So he gives a couple of examples, that go back into the Old Testament. That when you had an ox that was going around and around in circles grinding the corn for you, that if he wanted to stop and eat some, he could. He was doing the work. And the priest, when they were doing their service in the temple, that was the way they were fed and the way their families were provided for, as a certain portion belonged to them. And so it's no different in our time. Those that are laboring should be able to receive of the gospel. They can live by the gospel. 1 Timothy 5 says, let the elders that rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in word and doctrine. For the scriptures say, thou shalt not muzzle the ox that treads the corn, and the laborer is worthy of his reward. Verses 17 and 18 of 1 Timothy 5. So, I think that people that God has called, and people who have, shown us that they're going to be faithful and do the work that God's called them to, that they're worthy of their hire. Now, I've hardly ever seen a situation where somebody just, right off the bat, got to go into full-time ministry. There's always this paying of your dues, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think God is, showing us that. And, again, we read about Paul in the scriptures, and he often worked to provide for himself and even some of those that were traveling with him. So, we're not too good to do that. But I do think that a church, whether it be a church that somebody's pastoring or a sending church that's sending out a missionary, and it's within their ability to do better for that person, but they just won't. Something's wrong there. If they got the idea they're supposed to keep them poor and humble, or whatever, I don't know. Now, that's not to say that you can't mess up on the opposite side. I don't know of any situations I've ever seen this happen, but that doesn't mean that I ought to be making $100,000 a year, to pastor Landmark Baptist Church. That'd be wonderful, but I really don't think, that's in line. Now, if I was pastoring a church full of doctors and lawyers, that probably would be, in line. But, so, the Lord has to guide in all of that, but people that are doing the ministry are worthy of being compensated for doing that. And so we just have to understand that, not be afraid to ask for it. It's not wrong to say, hey, I need you to support me so I can go do this work. And then churches, need to feel a sense of obligation as well. That's one of the reasons that our church and many churches really work hard to raise mission awareness and to encourage people to give extra and give sacrificially for missions, because we want to support as many people as we can that are going out to do this work. But we can't afford to have the attitude, well, hey, if you can't pay me a decent wage, then I'm not going to do it, because it's not about the money. It's about the calling that God has placed on our life. Now, I might not be able to do it quite as effectively. I might not be able to give as much time to it because I do have to provide for my family. But, if I need to work, then I need to work. That's how things go. Acts 18, verses 1 through 3 say this. After these things, Paul departed from Athens and came to Corinth, and he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, lately come from Italy, with his wife Priscilla, because that Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome, and came unto them. And because he was of the same craft, he abode with them and wrought, for by their occupation they were tent makers. In 1 Corinthians 4, verses 11 and 12 says, even unto this present hour we both hunger and thirst, and are naked, and are buffeted, and have no certain dwelling place, and labor, working with our own hands. Being reviled, we bless. Being persecuted, we suffer it. 2 Thessalonians 3, 8 through 10. Neither did we eat any man's bread for naught, but wrought with labor and travail night and day, that we might not be chargeable to any of you. Not because we have not power, but to make ourselves an example unto you to follow us. For even when we were with you, this we commanded you, that if any man would not work, neither should he eat. So Paul says, hey, we worked, we did what it took. Even sometimes we worked to be an example, to show people what they should be doing and to be an example to them. We have to admit that our choices might be limited if we have to work a secular job. To blend the two, to be able to do ministry and work the secular job, there's going to be some limitations, but God always seems to work that out. There always seems to be a way that He provides, you can't. I remember when I first went to seminary, the first job I had down there, I told them when they hired me, that I couldn't work on Sundays, I couldn't work on Wednesday night, and I couldn't work through the week. I couldn't work before 2 o'clock because I had school. So I was pretty limited, wasn't it? But, right off the bat, I got a job, and they worked with me under those conditions, and there was no problem. Then I got a new manager, and the first thing he did was schedule me for Sunday. And I went to him and explained, hey, when I hired on, this was the agreement, blah, blah, blah. And he said, I understand that that's what the other guy told you, but I can't do that because you don't have seniority. These other people shouldn't have to work on Sunday if they don't want to. And I said, all right, well, then I got to give you my 2 weeks notice. And I said, and my 2 weeks notice includes that I won't be here on Sunday. So if you want me to work for you for another 2 weeks, I'll do that, but I'm not coming on Sunday because that's the agreement that we had when I first came here. And he said, well, see you later. So that was the end of that. But then God provided another job. So, ultimately, all of our trust and all of our confidence is in Him. He's the one that we're depending on. And even possibly you're having to work might open some doors. You might be able to witness to people that you wouldn't normally meet. You might be able to build some relationships with your coworkers that eventually will, bring them into the church. And so there's a positive side, but I do always tell people, be careful, because you don't want to steal from your boss. And, if you're in a situation where it's okay for you to talk to people and you got a lot of downtime and things like that, then okay, that's probably fine. But if you are putting off what you should be doing for your boss in order to have a long witnessing encounter with this person, you're stealing from your boss, and you shouldn't do that. And maybe you can have a brief encounter with this person and say, hey, man, I really need to get back to work right now, but man, can we get together some other time and talk? Maybe we go get a Coke together, or whatever. But there is a line there, and I think you have to be really, really careful to not cross that line. And I alluded to it a little bit earlier, but I want to close by saying that you need to get out of debt. If you're in debt, you need to get out of debt, and you don't need to create new debt, because it's going to affect your decision making, and you just don't need that. You need the freedom when God says, go do this for me, to say yes and it not have to do with money. And that's where this contentment thing comes in, because if maybe you're here now and God's blessed you with this salary, and if your wife is making some money and you got that, and you got these good things going, oh wow, yeah, we can afford a new car, and well, we really need a second car, and well, that's all good and fine until God says, go here for me, and the pay is 3/4 of what you're making now, and you happen to say,
Sorry, God.
I can't do that, you don't want to be in that position. You want to have the freedom. So stay out of debt and be wise with your spending, those things will honor God and will help you be prepared. So next time we will start talking about deputation is the next thing that we will talk about. So you should do exercise 4, I think. Yes. Do exercise 4 and 5 for next week. Any questions? All right, let's pray then. Lord, I pray that you help us all to understand the true meaning of contentment. And Lord, if we have made bad decisions with our finances that's got us into debt, that's got us into a bad situation, help us, Lord, to just make that a priority. We're going to overcome that. We're going to get out of debt. We're going to live within our means. Lord, the last thing we need is our testimony being damaged because we don't pay our bills or we don't do the right things with our money. And the last thing we need, Lord, is to be in a situation where we feel that you're calling us to do something, but we just don't think we can do it because of the money involved. We just don't need to be in those situations, Lord. So help us to do what would honor you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Amen. Canada.